Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. We are so excited to be hosting this wonderful panel presentation and the bias inside us. I just wanted to do a brief introduction and a little bit of housekeeping. My name's Heather Norton. I'm the Chief Science Officer here at Discovery Place, and hosting an exhibition and conversations like this is so thrilling and rewarding for us here at Discovery Place, so we're so thrilled that so many of you came out to participate with us. Just to give you a little background, The Bias Inside Us is a traveling exhibition of the Smithsonian. It's actually touring to 44 cities around the US, and we were one of the cities selected, so we're really thrilled about that. We're also just so proud to have these amazing leaders and speakers here for you today, so I'm gonna turn it over to them, and then I'll do some housekeeping at the end. So, Ben, go ahead.
Thank you, Heather. Good evening, everybody. How's everybody doing tonight? Good. Well, we're really glad that you're here. I'm incredibly excited to have this amazing panel of leaders in our community here to talk about bias this evening. And in just a second, I'm going to give them a chance to introduce themselves and talk a little bit about the communities that they represent and that they serve in our city. But before I do that, some of you have already seen the biased exhibit. Some of you have not, and we'll see that later. But I want to talk a little bit about bias just to frame our conversation before we get started. Obviously, if you've been upstairs, you know that bias is a preference or a prejudice based on some kind of difference, and it feeds our natural human need to belong. It's a result of survival shortcut that's deep in our brain. So all of us have bias, whether we'd like to admit that or not to ourselves. It's just a part of what it means to be human. It's an automatic thing that fires in our brain. Sometimes it comes out as a whisper, an unrecognizable one. Sometimes it comes out as a roar. And you know, the brain offers us options and what to do with our biases. And so these things can come out and be good, and they can also be very, very harmful. And so we want to talk about the ways in which a person can be very good, very well-intentioned, and still have bias that is unrecognizable. Tonight, one of the things we're going to talk about specifically is harmful bias, and the ways that bias can lead towards harm. And so that's going to be the frame of our conversation with these panelists this evening. There are other kinds of bias. It doesn't always lead towards harm, and you'll see that if you go through the exhibit. But tonight we're going to focus on that specifically, and we're going to talk about ways that bias creates damage and leads to real harm in our lives, in individuals' lives, in our community, right here in Charlotte, North Carolina. And then we're going to try to work together with these panelists to learn how to better identify bias, which is, I think, what the exhibit helps us to do, and then to be disruptors of bias. That's what this event is called tonight, Disruptors of Bias. We have some amazing disruptors of bias here who are going to introduce themselves in a moment, but we hope that all of you will become disruptors of bias by the end of the evening. So that's our ambitious goal for tonight. I'm going to start from my right and just invite each of our panelists to say who you are and what are the communities that you represent and you serve.
Well, good evening, everyone. I am Dr. Rosana Saladin. I am originally from the Dominican Republic. I've been in the United States 14, maybe 15 years. I lost count. I'm so acculturated right now that I forgot how many years I've been living here. I represent the Latino community. And I represent the Latina leaders in this community. So that's it. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I am the Reverend Dr. J.J. Flagg, and happen to be here as a representative of both the Black community and the disabled community. And so we'll be speaking from the perspective of what it means to lead in the work toward disability and disability justice.
Tanaka ni temp ni Lesson George Warren, ya ni tempru, ye isware, ye katabare, ye kampisa wachaha, re musaha, re Christian Tengono, manui la re. Hi. My name is Rue, like kangaroo. I'm a citizen of Catawba Nation. I live on our Green Earth Reservation, just about 30 minutes south of here. With my wonderful husband, Christian Tengono. And so I'll be talking about what it's like being Catawba, being a part of the Catawba community, and also a part of the LGBT community.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Cass Otley. I'm the Executive Director of Seeking Justice Charlotte. I'm an activist and a community organizer here. I represent the marginalized, sometimes forgotten community here in Charlotte. I'm originally from New York City, and I'm also an organizer for the Charlotte City Workers Union UE 150.
Hi everyone, my name is Asher Knight, and I am the rabbi of Temple Beth El here in Charlotte, North Carolina. And I would say that I represent, and no one can speak for the Jewish community, no Jew even attempts to do that, but I would say that I am representing the Jewish community here in Charlotte and also within our nation as well.
Thank you. Thank you all for your introductions. As you can see, we have a very diverse panel. It's been an honor for me as the host of the panel and to work to bring this panel together. And I'm excited to hear what we have to share tonight. We're going to start with I think it's an easy question and an obvious one, but it could lead to some really awesome stories, I hope. So we'll start from my right again, how have you personally experienced harmful bias in your life?
That's the easy one?
That's the easy one.
Okay. Well, being Latina in a non-Latina majority country, we experience bias, and we have our unconscious bias all the time. I think I've experienced it almost every day. I can just give you a few of the examples, and the most common one was I worked in education for 8 years, and I was sharing with my fellow panelists here earlier. Working in education, every time I said I work for CMS, the natural question is, where do you teach? I was not a teacher. I never taught in CMS. I was actually the only Latina leader in central office for CMS. I was the director of their community and family engagement department for several years there. But nobody assumed that I was in a leadership position, let alone that I was in a central position, in a central office position. Another one that was really, and it was harmful for me because I fought and for all my life, I've spent time preparing myself. I have a bachelor's degree in marketing. I have a master's degree in commerce from a university in Japan, and I have a PhD from Clemson University here. But nobody took time to understand or even ask that. It was just the fact that she is the Latina in the room, hence she is either a teacher or a staff member, a custodian, or something else at the school level. So that was the assumption. But the most harmful one that I experienced, and it was painful to hear, was when I married my husband. I am married to a Rockhillian. If you know what that is someone who was born and grew in Rock Hill, South Carolina. So that is a whole different type of breed. Let me just say. I married him, and it was the 4th of July, the year that we got married, 2015. And we were outside looking at the fireworks. We were sitting in our cars, and the neighbor came. And he said, "Oh, hi, my mom told me that you just got a new maid." And I was there. I froze. So remember that part of the bias response is that our amygdalas, when they respond to stimulus that is new to you, you either flight, fight, or freeze. I totally froze. I looked at him and I said, I have to come back. And I went back in the house, and I was furious. I was crying. And he said, his response was natural. He said, "Oh no, your mom must be confused. I just got married and this is my wife." So his response, he was oblivious to this. I was so infuriated, I could not even respond. And I let him know, this is what happened. She sees a Latina coming in out of your house every single day. Hence, the assumption is you got a new maid. So I had to elevate the voice and tell him that. And when I had the opportunity, of course, I went to my neighbor and I said, hello, I am Dr. Saladin Subero Liberty.
Yes.
And I am your neighbor.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. JJ?
Wow. One of the occurrences that comes to mind for me thinking about bias, I can recall working as a hospital chaplain and often being mistaken for a patient. And so I would be rolling around the hospital trying to serve our patients and be accosted by someone on the medical staff because they thought I was trying to escape. Often in the elevator and being snatched out of the elevator because somebody said, you got into this elevator without permission. And I would have to say, well, did you check to see if I was wearing a badge? One of the occurrences that sticks with me the most, I would say, was going into the room of a gentleman who wanted nothing to do with anybody else on the hospital staff. And I happened to enter the room and he asked the question, how do you navigate the world with your two maladies? And I paused because malady is not a word that we hear, used in everyday jargon. And so I said, excuse me, do you mean my disability? And he said, I mean, that's a part of it, but I'm talking about you're also being Black. And that was the first time that I had ever encountered Blackness and disability both as maladies. So that is one of those things that has stuck with me, and it's probably happened over 5 years ago now, but I can remember it as if it were yesterday. Because it told me when I came in the room that he saw me a particular way and he understood my experience from this vantage point, and it was up to me to challenge that. And so, thankfully, I had the opportunity as the chaplain to be with him in his final moments. Interestingly enough, he didn't want anybody else in his room. So the one that he saw as having two maladies ended up being the one that was with him as he took his final breath.
Thank you, JJ. Rue?
So first off, looking at me, you would never know that I'm a citizen of a tribal nation, right? And I think that for tribes on the East Coast, that is actually the biggest frustration, is the entire erasure of the fact that we still exist. I take after my dad. I look just like my dad, very pale, blue eyes. But my grandfather was never racialized as Catawba, even though he grew up on the reservation, was the first person in the tribe to go to college. My mom, similarly, was never racialized as Catawba, always racialized as other things. And so there's this kind of deep frustration of just never being seen as who we are from where we're from. Now, that's for the Catawba side, and I have a lot more to say when we get to the community kind of bias stuff. But I think that for me, I have to always come out as Catawba, like remind people, oh, I'm a citizen of Catawba Nation. But my queerness, my gayness is not something I necessarily have to come out with, because it's kind of right there for if you talk to me or hang out with me for any amount of time. And so that's where I've experienced my most personal bias. When I first moved back to the reservation in 2017 to work on our language project and other things, one of the first things that I got plugged into was working with our kids, because our children are our future and we really want to invest in them and we want to have these opportunities for them. And I just remember not once, not twice, but thrice, I had people saying to either people in the child care system and the cultural center saying that they didn't think I should be working with children because I'm gay, because I'm queer, because I'm part of the LGBT community. And you see that rhetoric cranking up every year, every month, it seems, this idea that we're inherently predatory, that the only effect we could have on children is an inherently negative or catastrophic one. Another instance that comes up was actually my husband and I are going through the green card process, and it is incredibly confusing for people who have grown up with status in the United States like I have. You might know that the immigration system is horrible, but actually having to see it and work through it is just mind-boggling and confusing at every step and scary at every step as well. And at one point, my husband and I were trying to get his tax ID number, and we were on the freaking IRS line for an hour and 30 minutes, waiting. We finally get this woman. She's talked to my husband. Everyone's getting confused, and then I talked to her, and I was like, yeah, you were just talking to my husband. And she was like, your husband? And then hangs up the phone after this hour or 30 minutes on this phone call. And it's like, at that point, I'm not going to call the IRS back. But of course you have to, because that's what you have to do to be able to get through this process. And so those are the things that come to my mind.
Thank you. Yeah.
Wow.
Yes.
I think the first time I experienced bias, I was in middle school. And I had a best friend, and she used to always come to my house. We used to wear one another's clothes, and she would always come over for dinner. And one day she invited me to her house for dinner, so I was really excited, Told my parents, I'm going over to Lisa's house for dinner. And so, got dressed and everything, went to her house, walked in her house. Her mom kind of took a look at me, and everybody went in the kitchen, right? So I'm like, okay, maybe they're cooking, they're getting the food together. I don't know, I'm a kid. So I'm kind of sitting in the living room by myself. And her mom came out and asked me to leave. And I can still feel it now. And, it just, I didn't even know what to feel. I was like, well, did I say something wrong? But then I only said hello. I went the whole walk home. I kept thinking, what could I have done for this lady to take one look at me and ask me to leave? And then when I got home, my parents were like, well, I thought you were going to dinner. What happened? So then I had to explain to my parents what happened. And of course, they were really upset. And it was really hurtful. It really was. We're still best friends to this day, because, of course, we talked through it. We were still going to be friends regardless. But it was really hurtful, and it just made me look at a lot of things differently because, my house, everybody came to my house. I had friends that were every color, every nationality. It didn't matter. And so, yeah, that was the first time I experienced it. Yeah.
Thank you. When I was growing up in the Jewish community, so much of our significant education around youth was focused on Holocaust education, and yet, and never again. And there was so much emphasized about how also we had come to America and the successes that we had, and everything had changed. And I really felt like, it was like, more Holocaust education. Why do we need to learn more? I really struggle with that. And then in middle school, I had an experience, which was my first experience. And in middle school, what happened was I lived in Miami, Florida for 2 years. And a Hurricane Andrew came and destroyed our house and really destroyed everything and leveled everything. And people were coming by the house in our neighborhood to sort of get work, but to help do cleanup. And I remember we were in our house, and I opened someone knocked, and I opened the door, and they were asking, if we needed help to help do the cleanup at the house. And he looked at our door and saw our mezuzah, which is we placed on our doors. And he said, well, what's this? And I said, and I'm 13. And I said, well, we're Jewish, and this is, and I was 13, I wanted to be a rabbi too, so I was particularly, right? I'm like, we're Jewish, and this is our mezuzah, right? And right? And having no thing, and he said, you're Jewish, and then he put his hands on my head, checking to see if I had horns, right? And feeling to see if I had horns. And then stepped back and said, we're not working here, and walked off. And I vividly remember that experience, and have had subsequent types of experiences, whether in middle school or in high school, of people making jokes about exterminating our people, or jokes about Jewish stinginess, or whatever, or sort of any sort of recognition that somehow Jews control the world or also are vermin somehow at the same time, right? And so much so that even in Charlotte last year, as I was walking our COVID puppy around our neighborhood with our kids, and to just a few houses down from us, see swastikas painted on signs in our neighborhood, elevated for me, and having conversations now with my children around what it means to be Jewish, to recognize that people hate us as people because of our religion and culture and who we are as people, right? And it has profoundly affected me as well.
Thank you. We're going to start, Asher, and come back down.
All right.
We're going to keep going. So we've gone from the personal. Now we want to talk about how have you seen harmful bias impacting the communities you represent and serve?
Sure. So one of the things that I think is important is to recognize that when we're talking about anti-Semitism, we're talking about a couple of things that I think are really deeply affect our community. First is that anti-Semitism doesn't ever really go away. It sometimes increases and then and decreases and increases and decreases and increases. And we are in a moment of increase, right? We are in a moment of increasing anti-Semitism. So when I say, and I really mean this as a community rabbi, that there has barely been a week that has gone by in which I am not working with members of our community to confront anti-Semitism that has happened in schools, or swastikas that have been painted on garage doors, or a sense of anxiety and vulnerability that has happened within our community over the last, I would say, 6 years. It has taken up considerable amounts of my time, energy, and effort, and frankly, the mind space and the vulnerability space of our people. That's number one. So there has been consistent and increasing anti-Semitism that our young people are experiencing, that our people are experiencing on college campuses, and frankly, even people are experiencing in places of work. Even with all of the DEI work that's happened, it's been amazing to hear what's happened. So that's happening. In addition to that, and I guess one of the things I would say is that we have, and I know we're not usually very public about this, but our community has had significant security threats against our community. And those security threats have included bomb threats and threats of attack. And so when you come into the Jewish community in Charlotte, you're going to see a significant amount of security, right? And that security, whether it's at the Jewish Community Center or at the synagogues that we have, none of the Jewish institutions, or let me say this, all of the Jewish institutions have an immense amount of security, far above and beyond what I think frankly exists at most, not looking at my friend who's the minister of Byers Park Baptist, but at other churches, right? Right? And so you sort of wonder, like, why? Why are we having this much security? Well, every amount of security that we have has been actually, really in response to very real threats that have been coming from Christian nationalists and white nationalists and supremacists that have been that we have experienced and that we have dealt with. And when you add to that the Tree of Life shooting in Pittsburgh, or my personal friend, Rabbi Charlie Citron Walker, who was held hostage in Colleyville, Texas, who was a classmate of mine, and you add all of that up, it means that our children come to religious school passing by security every single time. It means every single time that our people come to the synagogue, they have to go through security. And that's a very different reality than I think many people have, to the point that, and I'm not, not to emphasize this point, we're spending millions of dollars a year on security and not pouring that into our people. Does that make sense? And it pains me every single day, right, that our people feel that sense of anxiety and fear. And when things happen across the country, it elevates that tenfold. And so we're in a constant place right now in cycle of responding to increased hate.
Do you mind telling quickly the story about the RNC and the call from the FBI? Do you mind sharing that?
Yeah, no, I think that, I mean, when the RNC came here, you know, the FBI and the Secret Service and the security apparatuses appropriately were working with high, targets and what was sort of listed as targets, and the Jewish community was absolutely listed as one of the top targets that we, the FBI and Secret Service, were preparing for and recognized. But we were outside of the cones of security that was going to protect at the time the president and the RNC. And so, you know, just like that, so like, you know, RNC comes to Charlotte, and I joked with my leaders at the time, because we didn't do this, but I wanted to take a congregational cruise and call RNC later and go like get everyone out the door. But I wanted to do it not because of political issues like that. That's not the point. The point is that we actually chose not to have Shabbat evening services for 2 weeks in order, in person. We went back. We were in a solid Zoom state, right, for our services, because we didn't want anyone coming to the synagogue because of potential targeted realities. And like, I just don't know if people in Charlotte understand that that's what our people are going through right now.
The reason I asked you to share that is I think some people would not understand the unintended impact of a 100%. Political decision like that on the Jewish community. So thank you for sharing that. Cass, how about you?
I just think I'm going to talk about some of the violence in the community. And there's violence in every community, but I think it's always looked at differently when it's in the Black community. And I think, you know, a lot of times, even with our kids, you know, different things that happen immediately, it's different. You know, well, they're violent and they're this and they're that. And that's a lot of stress for these kids to live under. You know, I worked for CMS for 24 years. I retired last year. And, you know, when you look at the school system, you know, a lot of these kids need help. A lot of them come from marginalized, you know, communities. A lot of them, their parents aren't around. A lot of them are dealing with all types of conditions, but no one ever looks at that. You know, they always look at, well, he's late, or he doesn't have his book bag, or how come he didn't do the homework? But they never sit to take the time to find out why. You know, they never take a second to, you know, to maybe knock on the neighbor's door and say, hey, you know, I see you guys out here by yourself. You know, is everybody okay? Is everything okay? And that, to me, is a lot of the problem. You know, we have a lot of angry kids. We have a lot of kids that don't have any outlets anymore because a lot of the resources and money has been pulled out of the community, especially the Black and brown community. And so you have that, and then on top of that, you have the element of criminalizing these children. You know, when you think of, you know, them looking at third graders and projecting what kind of prisons they're going to build, instead of looking at third graders and putting and pouring into them and giving them the things that they need to build them up to be productive, great human beings, it's scary. And that happens, and we all know it, and we don't say or do anything about it. And that's an issue. You know, so, you know, walking around as a Black person, as a Black woman, you know, it depends on how I'm dressed, you know, how I'm perceived. I've come from the gym in a hoodie and sweatpants, and, you know, people are locking their doors and moving away, and then I'll come, you know, dressed nicely, and, you know, I'm perceived totally differently. And I think sometimes, you know, we need to think about how we're treating other people. You know, I try to treat people the way I want to be treated. And I think, you know, as a society, we just have to do better with that, because it is stressful. It's extremely stressful. You know, if you think about the amount of kids that we've seen in Charlotte, I mean, I've saw 10 of my kids in the past couple of years get murdered. Some by other kids, some by adults. It is horrible. But, we see it, and now it's become so normalized, and we're so desensitized, even with these school shootings. It's another one, That's a problem. There shouldn't be one. There should be none. And we should be outraged with every one of them. Because at the end of the day, these are children. And they're not just that person's children. They're all of our children.
So I want to go back to the idea I was talking about before of erasure, like this, this ignorance around Native communities, that we exist, what we are like, what it's like being there. And there's the interpersonal side. So I'm a Rock Hillian. And so I'll be amongst other Rock Hillians. And one person will be like, oh, so where do you live? And I'll say, oh, I live on the reservation. And they say, what reservation? And I say, the one past the mall. The one that's been there since before Rock Hill existed. And so there's that kind of interpersonal thing. But then you think, I'm really into education. That's what I like to do. I like to educate people. So, I'm very patient. I say, oh, it's the Catawba Reservation. But then you think, like, why? Why don't people know this? Well, when you look at state standards across the country, 90% of state standards don't mention Native Americans after 1900. What's happened since 1900? 1924, Native Americans become citizens for the first time of the United States. 1934, which is when the federal status for tribes was created. The 1950s, when the United States government went into tribes and said, you know what, we've decided you're no longer a tribe, which they called the policy of termination. There was the American Indian Rights Movement, which had some amazing, amazing activism come from it. There's just so much history that's happened since then, including the Indian Child Welfare Act. And so people don't know that. They don't get that in school. All they know are these kind of historical representations of Native people. And so if you don't hear anything about a people after 1900, what assumption are you supposed to take away except that they no longer exist? What is something that people do know about tribes? The Trail of Tears, right? This is something, if there's one thing we know about tribes, it's the Trail of Tears. But even that hides information. For example, it wasn't a singular Trail of Tears. It was many, 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 many forced removals. It wasn't just during the Andrew Jackson administration. Practically every president up until Theodore Roosevelt oversaw their own removals of tribes, including Abraham Lincoln. But this is something that we do learn about in school. And this came to a head a few years ago. Two of our really amazing young Catawba women, they were in IB US history. And in this class, the teacher wanted to have a debate kind of experience for the kids. And so the debate topic he chose was whether or not Indian removal was good for tribes, whether or not this forced march of tribal nations was in fact good for tribes. And two of the children that he assigned to debate for removal being good were the two Catawba women in his class. And he knew that they were Catawba. And so this is just, different levels of this kind of experience. And, it can be kind of frustrating on kind of an interpersonal level. But the thing is that no one learns this stuff. There's never a moment when you become a police officer or a lawyer or a politician or a doctor that you actually learn any of this history or learn about tribal nations. We saw this on full display back in November, Native American Heritage Month, when the United States Supreme Court heard its 13th attack on the Indian Child Welfare Act in the last decade and a half, in which one of the Supreme Court justices said that the tribes prior to colonization were only just fighting each other all the time, that they're inherently garrulous and warlike and therefore can't be considered to be a group with concerns in common with each other. And so why do I mention that case? Because this is a law that was created in the 70s to right over 120 years of the United States government purposely removing children from tribal communities, sending them to boarding schools, and then later sending them to families outside of tribal nations. This was a law that was created to keep tribal children within our communities. I've seen it work in my community. There were these 5 children who were about to be sent off, 4 different directions all over the place. But because of the Indian Child Welfare Act, they were able to stay together and stay in the community. And now it looks like this law is about to be struck down by people who know nothing about Native American communities. So that's what I always go back to. Yeah.
As it relates to the disability community, I think it's important for me to lead by saying that when you hear me speak, just as Rabbi Asher said, None of us can speak for the whole community. And so when you hear me speak, I'm one person with a disability talking about what it means to navigate the world as a disabled person. I want you to notice that I have used the word disability and disabled several times in the last few moments. I do that with great intention because folks tend to have an allergy to the word disability and disabled. When we talk about folks with disabilities, we use other words like handy-capable or differently able, and I don't know why. I'm just gonna be honest. There is nothing wrong with saying that someone is disabled or that they have a disability. And so when I'm a part of conversations like this, I like to let folks know that it is okay to see me as someone with a disability. Very often I am in conversation with folks and they will say, I don't see you as someone in a wheelchair. Well, what do you see me as? I mean, because my wheelchair was inescapable. I needed to be in it in order to get into this room. And so if I were not in it, we would not be having this conversation. So the conversation around disability, I want us to be very careful that when we are engaging folks with disabilities, that we don't unintentionally erase their disabilities when we are in interactions with them. The reason why that is important is because that calls to our attention the ways in which ableism shapes the way we engage with folks. And so ableism is the idea that those who are not disabled should or they do have an amount of privilege that those of us who navigate the world as people with disabilities do not, that they should be seen as superior. If you want to learn more about that, there's a part about ableism that is in the exhibit upstairs. This is important because if you can't see me as someone with a disability or you don't understand that ableism is a problem, then you will expect me to do things that I cannot do. And you will expect things out of me that I cannot give. And this is often a problem when folks navigate relationships with people with disabilities. It's either that you over expect things from folks with disabilities or you put us in the position of demeaning what we bring to the table. So what do I mean? Going out with my wife to dinner, who happens to be in the back of the room today, we often, I'm not gonna call her name because she hates attention, but we often will go to dinner and the folks who will take our order will talk to her and not talk to me. They will often say, what is it that he would like to have? As if I'm not there in the room. And so I say all of that to say, I hope that after we have had this conversation that we are a lot more attentive to how we deal with folks with disabilities in our lives.
Thanks, JJ.
Thank you. Unfortunately, our bias precedes us most of the times. And when we think about immigrants, what do you folks think about? Hispanics? Mostly, right? We talk about immigrants and we say Hispanics, Hispanic women, Hispanic men, Hispanic children. But we have many immigrants in our community, some of them in very high paid positions in corporate America. They are here as immigrants, they just are not the loud ones like us. And I want to just call the attention to especially the highly skilled immigrants that we have in our community. Some of us who come here with high degrees in education, but are working as taxi drivers, are working in restaurants because of the immigration system that you so colorfully talked about. They are not allowed to work on these professions. Folks, we have doctors, we have educators, we have architects, engineers who are now working in very low pay works. If you go to the report, New Americans, it's still from 2017, but the New Americans report for Mecklenburg County talks about that immigrants in this community represented almost 14% of the GDP. Did you all know that? Of the GDP.
Yeah.
Did you all know that? Or did you think that we were here using Social Security funds? So I want to challenge this group to look further and challenge those in positions of power and privilege and decision making to take a look at your hiring practices. Because if we want to disrupt, and I probably went ahead with the next
keep
question.
going, yes.
If we want to disrupt biases, this is one of the ways that we can do it. Not because you see an immigrant coming, you assume that he's unskilled, or you assume that needs to have the lowest pay. And let me talk about lowest pay in women as well. That is also a bias. I just saw a report from the Chronicle of Philanthropy, who was talking about that nonprofits led by women have the least amount of grants that they can close. And I have some leaders here that are leaders in nonprofits. Hopefully that's not your case, but nonprofits led by women have issues getting grants and funding, much more so than nonprofit led by men. And this is not my words. This is the Chronicle of Philanthropy, and it just came out. So what is leading our decision? Who are we seeing when we are hiring, when we are giving the funds to? Are we doing it because it's toxic charity? Or are we doing it because they are human beings who are working and who needs a little bit extra that we don't have? That's all I have.
Thank you, Rosanna. You started us off. We only have a few more minutes, and so we have to skip some questions. Let's go right into the last one. How do we disrupt harmful bias? You've started us off well. We're going to go to Asher, and we'll come out and we'll end at JJ.
I think that disrupting harmful bias is about, first off, starting with ourselves, right? Taking a breath and taking a note, like noticing the bias that's before us and noticing that as a teacher and saying, what is happening? How am I responding to it? And what am I seeing that is my initial response? And taking a breath and maybe slowing down and saying, is that a real thing, or is that my bias in front of me, right? That's walking in front of me. So I think definitely first it is absolutely recognizing it begins with us. And if we start with ourselves, then we recognize that, quite frankly, we can make a lot of change, both in terms of the education that we bring to the communities and also the work that we do to sort of disrupt the biases. The other thing that I would say is that I like to say that we need to elevate complexity and nuance a little more, right? Or maybe when I say a little more, what I meant to say was a lot more. Okay. And what I mean by that is that, for example, in the Jewish community, right, we have, I said I didn't want to speak for all Jews because I don't know what it's like personally to be an LGBTQ plus Jew, right? And I don't know what it means to be a Jew of color. And I don't know what it means to be a Latino Jew, which we have lots of them and beyond, or an Asian American Jew. So we sometimes, we assume, right, make assumptions about people, right, and we don't understand that there's a much larger diversity of what's going on here, right? And so part of it is to say that we might make some assumptions, and we might need to check our assumptions all the time around everything, and just elevate the recognition that we only know what we know, and there's a lot that we don't. And quite frankly, there's much more nuance, much more complexity in the world. And that is, and from my perspective, both from a religious perspective, but a personal perspective, that's what makes our world beautiful.
Yeah, totally agree. Thank you, Asher. Cass, same question to you. How do we disrupt bias?
I think we need to speak out about it. And we don't always have to be nasty about it. You can have a conversation with someone without being rude. I think sometimes, we come off and, and I get the agitation sometimes, and sometimes people say things that kind of ruffle your feathers, or maybe it might be disrespectful, but have that conversation with that person. Sometimes you have to meet people where they are. Not everybody, like you say, is where you are or has your experiences. And sometimes you have to bring people in to help them understand you a little bit better. I think we need to take a little bit more time and care with one another. We're always in a rush. We're rushing here, we're rushing there. We're trying to size people up and put people in boxes and all this kind of stuff. And I think we need to slow down and really take the time to really look at people and just not try to put everybody in a box, and just listen to what they're saying and try to understand one another better. Just take the time.
I similarly all about education, and I think the process of self-educating is really, really crucial. I was telling JJ before, if I was doing this talk by myself, I know that 2 questions I would get is, what should we call you, like Native Americans? And how much are you? Which are the 2 questions I always get when I do presentations.
Okay.
Are you a full Indian? Well, I haven't had dinner yet, so no. And so the amazing thing is that those questions have been written about ad nauseum by Native people. And so you can find amazing, amazing writing by tribes. Think in your head, how many tribes do you think there are in the United States? You're wrong. It's more than 570 federally recognized tribes. That's from the swamps of Florida up to the frozen tundra of Alaska. Speaking of diversity, all of these places, all of these communities creating amazing, rich culture and knowledge about how to live on these landscapes in a way that doesn't destroy the earth, which is something that we all need to be thinking about right now. So that's really where I'd encourage people to start, is really diving in, reading, learning, listening, viewing art by Native people. And then I think for LGBT folks, I think the biggest way that we've moved forward is kind of that idea of like, come out loud, let people know that there are queer people in their lives. And then I just hope that people will take that empathy of saying like, wow, I have this family member who's LGBT, and think about all these other issues and think, wow, everyone is someone's daughter or someone's parent or someone's cousin, right? We're all just trying to get through it together. And I think we can do it. I think we can do it. We just got to put a little work into it.
Yeah, the work. Thanks, Rube.
So one of my favorite writers happens to be Parker Palmer. And he has a line in one of his books, To Know As We Are Known, that says that personhood is found in community. Ever since I read that line, it has stuck with me because I believe that one of the greatest ways to disrupt bias is to create space for folks to simply be. The way that we will challenge how people encounter us and see us, whether it be in a good or negative light, will be based on the way we create space for people to simply be who they are. And so when I come into a room, the question should not be, do I encounter you as a Black disabled male, but how do I encounter you as a full person? And if in the conversation, my Blackness tends to elevate itself in the conversation, or my being disabled elevates itself in the conversation, then allow that to be the thing that leads. But don't come into the space having already pegged me in a particular box. And so, leaning on the words of Parker Palmer, how can we create space for people to simply be the full person that they are, so that they might find personhood in community? I think that the way we disrupt bias is that we be the people who create space for people to be who they are in community, that we become community for those who cannot find it. It may sound very preacherish.
I like it.
I realize I'm leaning into a certain cadence here. But I'm hoping to call your attention to your ability to allow people to be who they have been created to be. I think that that's one of the greatest ways to disrupt bias. And with that, I will get off my soapbox.
Thank you, Jay. Rosanna, any final word for us?
So my mantra is inspire joy. And the only way that I can inspire joy is by letting people be joyful, enjoying their whole person, like you were saying, and just loving them as a human being. That's my purpose in life. I cannot get up in the mornings and not think about who else I'm going to impact, and that who, emphasis in who, is not what you look like, what you wear, where you work, where you've been. It's that person, that heartbeat that encounters me. And my hope is that I can touch that life in some way or another. And my hope for you is that we start looking at people as heartbeats, because that's what they are. They are a heartbeat that have been put there in that precise moment to you, with you, for you, to help you through this journey.
Thank you. Let's give our panelists a round of applause.